Great. Well, thanks for that. And thanks very much for inviting me here. I looked at the speaker lineup in the past, and it's been very impressive. So I'm happy to be part of the series. So what I want to talk about today is two things. So biological scaling, that is sort of life history scaling, allometric scaling, which is a methodology and a body of theory developed in biology that essentially comes out of physics, from statistical physics. And it's a way of looking at what we call at SFI call complex systems. So how the properties of a system change with the resolution at which you study that system, or as that system changes in size. And I'll explain what that means as we go on. And we're going to use that methodology and that body of theory to think about the evolution of human ecology. So when I'm talking about the evolution of human ecology, what I'm talking about is how humans very quickly developed technologically from foraging populations to the kinds of people we are sitting in this room today, living in urbanized, industrialized systems where we know the difference between that sort of those socioeconomies and those lifestyles are not genetically based. They're energetically based, they're culturally based. And so how can we use this body of theory and this methodology of looking at systems at different scales in order to understand something fundamental, I think, about the evolution of human ecology. So this is what the philosopher Dan Dennett would call our intuition pump. This is one of the most famous laws in biology, and it can really claim to be one of the most staggering laws in all of science. And that's not hyperbole. So what's going on here? This is called Klybers Law, and it's published in the 1930s. This is actually a plot that was generated sometime in the early 60s. But what this is showing is that if you take the metabolic rate of any species on this planet, and you plot that metabolic rate, the basal metabolic rate, so it's just the energy required to keep somatic maintenance going, and you plot that metabolic rate as a function of the average body mass of any species on this planet, I can tell you within a remarkably tight confidence interval what that relationship will be. And what makes this so remarkable is, if you think about it, all these different species on this plot have gone through hundreds of thousands to millions of years of quasi-independent evolution. So a naive assumption is, well, this plot could be scattered, just could be a pure shotgun blast. There's no a priori reason why there should be this tight relationship between the metabolic rate, the energy consumption, energy demand of a species, and its body size. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at a lot of these kind of plots and thinking about the energetics of biological systems and the energetics of human systems. And we're going to especially take use of the fact that humans are on this scaling line somewhere up on that, in that far left-hand corner. And we'll use that Klybers Law basically as leverage to understand something about the predictability and unpredictability of human societies and human energetics. So the overarching questions to me about the evolution of human ecology is essentially this question of human uniqueness, which is, I think it's a central tenet of anthropology. It's why anthropology exists as a discipline, and we're not all biologists, But the question is, how unique are humans as a species? Rather than just taking for granted, as I think as many anthropologists generally do, that we are a unique species. How unique are we? And secondarily, if so, in what ways? How can we measure quantitatively how unique we might be? And thirdly, how did this uniqueness evolve? So basically, if you can measure, if you can understand quantitatively how unique humans are, and you can understand in what currencies, then you're halfway to understanding how that uniqueness must have evolved. And that uniqueness we're going to see is how human ecology has evolved. And the overarching sort of framework I'm going to use for this talk is basically ask, where are we now energetically as a species, as the human species, in comparison to other species? And then how did we get here? How did we get to this unique position where we're all sitting in this room and doing things which biologically really don't make very much sense? We're sitting around, we're exchanging information, we aren't foraging for resources, we're not reproducing, we're not raising kids. We're doing something that's very dangerous for other mammals of our body size. So, to start at a very large scale, all energy that fuels life on this planet is coming from solar radiation. Solar radiation is coming into the Earth system, hitting the atmosphere. A third of it is being reflected back off into space. 70% is being absorbed into the Earth system. A tiny, tiny fraction of that, about 1% of that, is being actually used by net primary production to generate net primary production. But all of that energy is eventually re-radiated out into space as heat. And on an annual basis, this is in rough equilibrium. So for those of us that are interested in biological or anthropological systems, it's all about what's going on here. It's the complexities of how energy is being captured in the Earth system, and then how everything competes for that energy. And how that game is being played out between species, between populations, and between individuals. And humans obviously are playing a large role in that, in competing for that energy. And the way we're going to look at this mathematically and statistically is using allometric scaling or biological scaling, which is based on more math than this, but one of the primary things that we're going to be looking at is power functions. And power functions are very nice things. They're nice ways of describing systems, because what you have is you have a y variable that is scaling as a function of some intercept, some constant y0, with x to a power beta. And there's an awful lot of information in that power beta, as we'll explain in a minute. So power functions have a very nice property that you can linearize them just by taking the logarithms of both sides, and they become this nice linear relationship. So if you plot them graphically on x, y axes, on the y-axis and the x-axis, the relationship between the two is now a linear function, parameterized by that, the beta, and with an intercept. And we'll be looking at a lot of these different plots through the talk. And in allometric scaling, generally what you're doing is you're looking at the energy consumption of some biological system as a function of the size of that system, whether it's body size, so the units are grams, or whether it's population size, where units are individuals. And you're often looking at the size-specific energy, or which is just the intercept, and the slope, which tells you the response of changes in one variable to the other. So straight away from the intercept, from the exponent beta, there are lots of interesting things insights you can generate from them. And so one of the clear relationships we're looking for example, if that scaling relationship is greater than 1, that means that the energy consumption of that system is growing faster than the size of that system. And economists call this diseconomies of scale. On the other hand, you have what economists call economies of scale, which will be very important in this talk, where the size of a system is growing faster than the energy consumption of that system. So there's an efficiency to size, there are returns to scale to size. And there's the condition where simply size and energy are increasing at the same rate. So this is simply proportional isometric scaling. And we'll be looking at, as I say, a bunch of these plots. And basically asking, where is that scaling exponent? What is that beta value, and what can it tell us about the system? So if we just go back to Klybers Law for a minute, Klybers Law is a power function. Here, the metabolic rate of scaling is mass to the 3/4 power, and the 3/4 power is a sublinear power. So what this is saying is that in very real terms, on a mass-specific scale, elephants are indeed more energetically efficient than unicellular organisms. It takes a lot less energy to run an elephant than it does, or a gram of elephant than it does to run a gram of shrew, for example. So there's an economy of scale in biological systems. And we see this, what makes this so remarkable, this plot, is we see this over about 20 orders of magnitude variation, from unicellular organisms all the way up to the largest land mammals, and in fact the largest sea mammals, and in fact you can extend this to whole ecosystems too. So, now, when it comes to human uniqueness, we're now going to look at various plots about trying to understand, to what extent are humans unique, and we're going to compare humans to mammals in lots of different ways. So here we're just comparing different aspects of human life history to mammalian life history. This is published in a book chapter a couple of years ago. We have newborn mass, weaning mass, annual fecundity and production, biomass production as a function of body mass on the x-axis. The grey dots are mammals, the black dots are primates, and the red dots are humans. And so if you start in the top left-hand corner, you see in terms of newborn mass, so the size at which we give birth to offspring, we're entirely predictable for a mammal of our body size. In fact, we're bang on that line, and in fact, we're for primates too. So there's very tight selective constraints on newborn body mass, so we're not unique in that aspect at all. The same goes for weaning mass, which is an even tighter, there's even tighter selection on this distribution, but again, we wean our offspring at exactly the size you'd expect us to. Things get slightly more interesting when you look at annual fecundity. So this is human annual fecundity. So we produce very, very slowly, or very, very few offspring per year for a mammal of our body size. So we've really sort of decreased or pushed that limit because essentially in humans we made this investment in quality over quantity. We have fewer offspring and we make sure they don't die, as opposed to lots of other mammals that have tons of offspring and let a lot of them die and hope some survive. But even though we've lowered our annual fecundity or fertility rates in general, we haven't sort of broken this sort of mammalian envelope, this sort of threshold. We've just kind of lowered it as far as you can. But again, that's the general primate strategy, and we're just a large-bodied primate. So there's nothing particularly unique, or nothing totally unique about our reproductive rate. It's interesting, and that's why behavioral ecologists and life history theorists study it and have very good theories and really interesting data to explain how we've done this. But in terms of human life, in terms of life history, we're very predictable for a species of our body size. We can then scale this up, and then you say, well, what about population ecology level things, population dynamics? So we can play the same kind of game. We can plot, for example, this is on the same the x-axis here again, just body mass, and now we have looking at home range. So a home range is the size of the area an organism requires to meet its metabolic requirement. And again, the color schemes are grey dots mammals, black are primates, the green are chimpanzees for comparison, and the red are hunter-gatherers, or the solid red are. So it turns out the hunter-gatherers have very large home ranges for a body size. That's because they have very large social groups. They work together we'll see later, in networks that scale up in size, but up into the thousands. We have very predictable, or hunter-gatherers have very predictable population densities for mammals of the body size. These are industrial humans, that's us. So we live in very dense societies. But again, we just sort of push this envelope up. We haven't done anything unique. And we can play this game for a few other variables too. But this is very interesting too, I'll just point out. So if you look at group size in mammals, so social group size, and they're defined in various ways, but basically they're the number of organisms on average that you exchange energy or information with for fitness benefits. And what you see with across mammals is there's no clear sort of central tendency here. There's kind of these constraint envelope. That is, if you're a small mammal, it's good to be in an ever-increasing large group till you get to a certain apex, and then it declines again. That means it's ecologically very hard to maintain large group size once you're beyond a certain size. And these red dots are hunter-gatherer groups, hunter-gatherer group sizes. So we happen to exist, our body size is such that we exist on the apex of that distribution. So we just happen to be at the right body size that can maintain the largest kind of groups, which is kind of interesting. And in fact, through cultural evolution, now we exist in group sizes in thousands, millions, even billions in some countries, in religions. So this distribution has been pulled up through the roof up there. So, but it's interesting that we just fortuitously basically happen to be in the middle of that distribution. So in terms of population ecology, again, there's nothing particularly unique about human population ecology. It's interesting, but it's not truly unique. We can do the same thing with brain size. This is a log-log plot of total brain size as adult body mass using the same color scheme. And indeed, we're highly encephalized, but again, we haven't broken this mammalian constraint on body size, and of course, there's all kind of biomechanical constraints on that process. But individually, we're very encephalized, obviously. But things get more interesting once you start looking at energetics. So here, this is Klybers Law, again, just plotted for mammals. So if you take the average metabolic rate of a mammal as a function of its body size, you get this nice 3/4 power scaling. Human average basal metabolic rate is about 100 watts. It's pretty much predictable for a mammal of our body size. So 100 watts is interesting because that's about the metabolic rate of a slightly powerful household light bulb. So, give humans a few generations, we can do that. Give evolution 100 watts, and it can do this. It comes up with a very, very sophisticated machine. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the total metabolic rate, that is all the energy that you and I in this room are using to support our lifestyles, to run our cars, to heat our houses, build bridges, all the rest of it, all the infrastructure that essentially stops us dying on a daily basis, we're fluxing about 11,000 watts. So that's over 2 orders of magnitude greater than a mammal of our body size would be expected to use. So this is this is how we are truly, truly unique in terms of our energetics. So to me, the interesting part about cultural evolution and evolutionary anthropology is that. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And what are the consequences of that? So even on the global average is about 3,000 watts. So that's across all current, 219 nation states or whatever. So still, that's a very high number. But 11,000 watts in the US on average isn't even the highest. So the highest are in places like Saudi Arabia, for example, where that number gets up to about 40 or 50,000 watts. So the interesting thing about this is the equivalent body size of an organism that would flux 11,000 watts for its basal metabolic rate is about a 30,000 kilogram primate. So in essence, we are 30,000 kilogram primates, and there's 7 billion 30,000 kilogram primates on this planet, roughly. But what's even more interesting, but I don't have time to go into, is that I showed the very low reproductive rates for humans. We actually reproduce at exactly the rate predicted for a 30,000 kilogram primate. And we think there's something very fundamental there, and I published a few papers on this, because reproduction is all about energetic consumption and its investment in offspring, and basically the more expensive it is to raise offspring to viability is about how much energy you can consume over your life and store and transfer over generations. And so all that excess energy is being transferred to future generations, and we've lowered our reproductive rate in response to that. So anyway, sorry. So we can then say, okay, so energetically, on an individual basis, we are very, very unique. We're fluxing 2 orders of magnitude more than you'd expect from a mammal of our body size. That's 100 times more energy. So on a species level, what does this mean? Well, Well, on a species level, the total human energy consumption measured by fossil fuel consumption, which is the vast majority of energy output nowadays, is somewhere between about 15 to 20 terawatts. That's 50 to 20 trillion watts. So I don't usually think in trillions. So what is 15 to 20 terawatts? Well, global net primary production, where net primary production is all the energy that's captured by plants in a year and used to generate new production, leaves, wood, etc., is about 75 trillion watts. So as a species, we consume the equivalent of about, as one species on this planet, we consume the equivalent of about 1/4 of the entire energy that the Earth system uses to regenerate itself on a yearly basis. So this is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, that's how we are truly unique as a species. And if you think about it just purely objectively, it means evolutionarily we're incredibly successful. I mean, if the game is about competing for finite sets of resources, and we as one species have harnessed essentially 1/4 of the energy that's available to the Earth system, evolutionarily, we're very, very successful. Now, ecologically, we can make the argument that we aren't very successful. But then again, natural selection doesn't care about long-term consequences. It doesn't care about the longevity of a species. It just cares about your ability to compete within a generation and compete for those resources. So indeed, we might be a boom and bust species. We just might use up all the energy available to us very, very quickly and disappear just as quickly. And I think that's the most likely thing that will eventually happen. It's just the timescale in which that will happen. So that's where we are now as a species. And the question is, well, how did we get here? And how can we measure this in data that's actually out there that anthropologists have measured over the years? And we have to be slightly creative about how we generate data and then how we think about data. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the energetics of hunter-gatherers, and then we're going to think about the energetics of other subsistence level cultures, or horticulturalists, subsistence agriculturalists, and eventually industrialized economies and cities. And we're going to basically look for consistent or universal statistical structures that seem to quantify the energetics of these socioeconomies. So when we think about the energetics of hunter-gatherers, what we could do is we could go out into we could be ethnographers, we go out into the real world and actually measure the basal metabolic rate of a hunter-gatherer. But measuring the basal metabolic rate of anything is a very hard thing to do. You have to have very strict laboratory conditions, and which you just can't do in the field. You can measure things like field metabolic rate and resting metabolic rate, but not basal metabolic rate. But luckily, we have Klybers Law, which I already showed you, which is a very tight relationship between the basal metabolic rate and the body size of an organism. So as long as you know the body size of an organism, you can know it. You know its basal metabolic rate very, very well. There's a very tight relationship. So we're going to leverage that relationship. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about the spatial ecology of hunter-gatherers. And so again, we're going to look at the home range of a hunter-gatherer. And the home range is a function of its basal metabolic rate divided by a resource supply rate. That is basically just the energy density, the flux of energy available to that hunter-gatherer, which is obviously going to be environmentally dependent. Then we're going to scale out to populations and say, okay, so a population of size n is going to have a metabolic rate, which is just simply going to be the sum of the individual metabolic rates. And so therefore the total territory size, or the total space that a population of size n of hunter-gatherers would need, would simply, the territory size A should simply scale linearly with the number of individuals. So that is, if territory size simply responds linearly to the number of individuals out there, then the total territory size should just be a linear function of n. And the question is, what is that exponent? Is that a 1 in the real world? What is that beta? And then we get to the scaling relationships. So if we measure real-world data, this is data from Lewis Binford's book, but you can replicate this with other data. His just happens to be the largest data set we have available. And if you plot the territory size of a hunter-gatherer as a function of the population size of a hunter-gatherer in a sort of very naive plot. And he has data on, I think it's about 340 hunter-gatherer groups. And so these are measures from basically instances in time when that particular ethnographer was there on the ground. What you see straight away is that this scaling relationship is less than 1. It's very noisy, the R-square is low, but it's statistically less than 1. So what this means that essentially as population size is increasing, territory size is increasing, but less than proportionally so. So as hunter-gatherer populations get larger in size, they become denser, so they get packed more into space. What does this mean? Well, if each hunter-gatherer requires a certain area to meet their metabolic requirement, it means that if you exist in a larger and larger population, you actually require functionally less area per individual to meet that requirement. And that's the definition of an economy of scale. So there's this spatial economy of scale in the energetics of these hunter-gatherer populations. So there's a lot of variation here on your y-axis, and that's obviously because some of these groups exist in the Arctic, some of these are tropical, some of these are from the desert, and we can just break them out like this by very coarse habitat. And the results are kind of interesting. They're kind of, on the one hand, what you expect, on the other hand, kind of interesting. So up here, you have basically Arctic groups and boreal forest groups, so high latitude groups, where the individual spatial requirement is greatest, obviously. And down here, you have coastal groups and tropical groups, where the individual spatial requirement is much lower. In fact, so in the Arctic, an individual requires about 50 times more area to meet the metabolic requirement than if you're in the tropics or if you're living on the coast. The interesting thing about this plot is that while the environmental variation makes sense, so basically the warmer it gets, the less space you have to access in order to meet your energy requirements as a forager. What's interesting though is they all seem to achieve these same kinds of economies of scale. So there's the same benefits to living in a large group, whether you're in the Arctic or whether you're in the tropics. So those efficiencies are maintained, but the overall scale of that system responds as the environment changes, which is interesting. So another way of looking at this is you can just take the raw data, as I showed you before, as noisy as it is, and you do a very similar kind of thing, but we're just using a general linear model here, which incorporates environmental temperature, rainfall, some very simple parameters. And all this data basically collapses to a much tighter scaling relationship once you control for those variables. The R-square you'll see is now much, much higher. You're now explaining about 86% of the variation in territory size by these very few simple predictors. And the overall scaling is about the same. It's still this very tight sublinear scaling. So there's this spatial economy of scale to these hunter-gatherer systems. So I first published this when I was in grad school. It was like 2007, and Scientific American picked it up, and they produced this nice little graphic which just conceptualizes it nicely, I think. So basically, as population size increases, home range size is increasing at a much slower rate. But what's actually happening is, each of those encephalized individuals are being, there's a density-dependent effect, and you're packing many more brains into space than another mammal of our body size. So if you think about, basically the computational power that comes out of this square because it has that many brains cooperating within it, think of how many, the complexity of ecological solution, or the speed at which people can achieve solutions to problems they have, as opposed to other mammals that don't have this, either the encephalization or this economy of scale in their energetics. And I think there's an awful lot between this information and the packing, this density effect, feeding back into the energetics of hunter-gatherer systems. Okay, so all this is nice, well and good for hunter-gatherers. What about other subsistence level societies? So basically, what happened is me and Rob Walker, I think, who gave a talk here in the last couple of years, we went to UNM Library, where we were both doing our grad work. pulled off all the ethnographies from the shells that we could find. So that was about 1,000 cultures, just under 9 million individuals, covering about 13% of the world's land surface, so not a trivial sample. And then we broke those ethnographies into these different kind of subsistence types, and we can talk about the specific definitions of these groups later if anybody's interested. But essentially what goes on is here we have our hunter-gatherer data set, but as you move into horticulturist forages in South America, which is mostly forages that incorporate some amount of horticulture into their diets, you see the same kinds of economies of scale with a slight drop in the intercept. So basically they're acquiring less space per individual because now they're extracting energy out of their, they're effectively increasing the energy density of their landscapes. And this increases as you basically intensify your technological manipulation of the environment around you. There's this kind of niche construction effect. But at the same time, you're maintaining these economies of scale. So the per capita benefits of existing in larger and larger groups hold in exactly the same kind of ways as you're going through this kind of technological development. So this is for subsistence groups. So the next thing was we asked, well, do you see this in industrialized societies? And the answer is no. So at least at this level. So what we did, so these orange dots here are individual nation states, which you can get from the World Resources Institute, or many, the UN too has lots of data on this. But basically, if you just plot the area of a country as a function of the population size of that country, you just get a purely linear relationship, a neutral relationship. Why do you do this? Well, obviously, because most people in industrialized countries don't forage for a living. You don't farm for a living in order to extract your energy. We do things like this, where we exchange abstract knowledge for green bits of paper that we go and then buy food with, etc. So we participate in these very sort of complex market economies. But the interesting thing is if you take the energy consumption of these countries as a function of the population size of that country, you retrieve exactly the same economy of scale. That's because energy is responding in exactly the same way to population size, but it's no longer through the medium of spatial energetics. That symmetry between space and energy use and the ecological symmetry has been broken. We're still responding to energy in the same way, but that energy is being delivered to us through pipelines and through electricity and through fossil fuels. And so what this is showing, we'll see this in another plot in a minute, so this is the efficiency of living in larger and larger populations or larger and larger countries because there's more and more infrastructure to sustain that population. So life is easier in general in larger industrialized human populations than it is in smaller human populations. So there's a lot of work at SFI that looks at these relationships in cities, which is, again, another talk in itself. But I'll just say that there are these remarkable scaling relationships that essentially show exactly the same patterns in cities. So as cities grow in size, the energy consumption in a city increases, but at a sublinear rate. And that's because of larger cities generally have more infrastructure. And so on a per capita base, you're actually using less energy to live in a city. However, the absolute energy that city uses is going up. And hence, the city size is not a solution to the energy problem. It is on an individual basis, but it isn't on a population basis. And you can also use this to look at national economies. So this is looking at basically international development. We did a paper on this in Bioscience a few years ago. So this is equivalent of Klybers Law for an economy. So you have on the y-axis here per capita energy consumption in watts. So this is including biological, so basal metabolic rate plus the total metabolic rate, all the other energy that we use to fuel our lives, as a function of the size of the economy, okay? So on a per capita basis, so an individual's contribution to the economy. And what you see is a very interesting relationship. So these are about 220 nation states. Each of these wiggles is their time series from 1950 to about 1950 to about 2010, just before we published the paper. And what you see is basically all these countries developing that way. They're all sort of creeping up this line. But this line, as you'll see, is very similar to what it was in the previous plots. It's sublinear. It's about 0.75-ish. The numbers don't matter so much, but the sublinearity of it does. And so what this means is that you get very similar kind of relationship between countries in terms of the energy consumption and the size of the economy, which is a measure of the actual size of that system that energy is supporting. Now, for international development and sustainability questions, this is a very depressing plot. There's nothing hopeful about this plot, because all these countries down here are existing at about 100 watts. This is 200 watts, 300 watts. So this is barely functional. On an individual basis, individuals down here are living on a day-to-day basis, on an energetic basis. And obviously all these countries want to get up there as fast as they can. And because this is a power law, there's no asymptote here. This just keeps increasing, and all these countries are increasing up there too. So it means that the total energy consumption of this entire system is just increasing. But the question is, well, is there enough energy out there for all these little countries in order to get up there? And the problem is there isn't. And so, one of the solutions people have proposed is, well, maybe us in the US or the UK or Luxembourg there, maybe we decrease our lifestyles down to somewhere down here where Costa Rica is kind of the poster child for development, where you have this balance of good standard of living, good healthcare system, where you're protecting your environment, etc. But in order for people, or for us in very developed countries to come down here, it would require us to get rid of jet airplanes and EKGs and all that infrastructure that we rely on. So it isn't really a viable option that's going to happen, at least by choice. So these scaling relationships are actually a very powerful way of looking at energetic consumption at different levels in human systems. And they tell us something about the universality between the size of human systems and the energy consumption required to sustain that system. So I'll go through this briefly, because one of the questions in biology was, where do these economies of scale in biological systems come from? So why is Klybers Law this sublinear law? So why is that exponent less than 1? Because a very understandable, naive assumption would say, well, if I doubled the size of an organism, why isn't the energy requirement of that organism just double too? Very simple. But this is saying if you double the size of an organism, you only actually require 75% more energy. So there's an economy of scale. Where does that come from? The argument, the theory developed by a couple of very close colleagues of mine, West and Brown, argued that basically biological organisms are supported by these fractal dendritic space-filling networks. These, the distribution systems that support our three-dimensional bodies have this particular statistical and mathematical structure to it, and that results in this sublinear scaling, this sort of fractality of the distribution networks that support that system. And so we simply asked, in hunter-gatherer systems, for example, is there any evidence of this kind of same kind of self-similarity, fractality? And the answer is there is. So if you look at hunter-gatherer social networks, generally non-anthropologists or non-hunter-gatherer anthropologists included often think of hunter-gatherers as existing in relatively simple social networks, living in bands, etc., of families. But in fact, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you generally belong to a family, and then you're fluctuating. There's this fission-fusion process where sometimes you're in very dispersed small groups, then sometimes in the year you're aggregating into larger groups. Then every now and again, throughout the year, you'll get together for these mass events, either these ceremonial events or these big hunting events, and you'll belong to a larger ethno-linguistic population. You might not know all the individuals, but you'll recognize them as, you know, speaking the same language, using the same ornamentation, dressing similarly, that kind of thing. So they actually have this complicated structure, social network structure. And there's an awful lot of movement that's also going around between these groups. And so you can quantify, basically in Binford's data, he quantified, or he gathered estimates for all the different sizes of these groups at different levels, and you can plot out, this is a box plot of those distributions. So this is just individuals, family, the small groups, larger groups, etc. And those distributions are over those 340 populations each time. And straight away you see this kind of geometric scaling. And so we don't have to go through the statistics of that. But what that means is that essentially what's going on in hunter-gatherer groups is you can measure the branching ratio. That is, it turns out that there's about 4 individuals in a family, which makes sense in a near equilibrium population. But there's 4 of those families in a small group, 4 of those small groups in a larger group, 4 of those in a regional population, all the way up to an ethno-linguistic population, which is the definition of a self-similar social network structure, a fractal-like social network structure, which looks like this. It's a tetrahedral network. We've seen this kind of thing since the 70s, but we can now really quantify this in data we have at hand. And you can see the modularity and the hierarchical nature and the fractality of this social network structure very clearly, where individuals belong to families, and essentially small groups look like scaled up families, and larger groups look like scaled up smaller groups, all the way up to a total population. So, and of course, if you think about this, if you think about, you know, the reason why these social networks exist is because information is being exchanged between individuals, and that information has fitness enhancing benefits. It's easier to make a living if you're making it a living with multiple people at once that are helping you out and you have reciprocal relationships with. And you can just think of, you know, in terms of like average path length, without even doing the math, you can just think, you know, the average path length of this person getting information to that person by going just through these connections is a lot less than if this was just all purely random and this was a pan-mixed population. So if you think about the informational exchange benefits of existing in a network like this, it's quite astronomical. So again, this is another paper I published in grad school, and when we first found this result, we were all really excited, and we thought, nobody's ever seen this, and, you know, isn't this exciting? We have this self-similar network in human systems, the same kind of things that you see in lots of biological systems. And it turns out sociologists have been talking about this for about 50 years. We had just seen it in hunter-gatherer systems where nobody had looked before. But it turns out that, you know, free-forming conversation groups show the same kinds of structure. Religions show the same. Firms obviously show this kind of structure, where you have these modular units that are bolted together in corporations of different sizes, but generally people work or interact at the same kind of levels, and then that's scaled up. Now, an interesting example of this is the US Army, for example. So I could show you the same plot for all the branches of the US military and all the other military organizations I could get data off the web for. And it's really interesting. So this is from their web page. From, you know, you just go to their web page and you click one link, and it talks about the average size of the different structural units within the US military. And sure enough, you have individuals, and they belong to squads of about this size that belong to, you know, I don't know all the terminology of the different levels of organization, but all the way up to divisions and regiments. And there's this consistent branching ratio too, this modular organization that scales up, this fractality, the self-similarity in military structures. And what's interesting about this is obviously the US Army is not a self-organized system. You know, it's not like they get a bunch of people together and say, just, you know, make this happen, guys, and they, you know, this is what they come up with. But at the same time, so there's some kind of organizational process, but there's kind of trial and error that's been going on for hundreds of years in this case. And it certainly isn't the case that, you know, somebody at West Point just sat down one day and said, yes, the most efficient, optimal thing we can do is we can, you know, our bifurcation ratio, our branching ratio should be about 4.3. No, this is kind of a, you know, emergent property of how these interactions have worked over time. So basically it turns out there's this universal structure to how humans form social networks. We see all the way from hunter-gatherer systems all the way up to militaries and firms and cities. So it's a very universal thing. Now this was really surprising too, because some people from England and the States combined to write a paper looking at exactly the same patterns that we had described in the hunter-gatherer data and asking whether they saw the same data in social mammals. And basically they do. I met one of them at a conference once actually, and they said when they first read the paper, my paper, they were very skeptical. They didn't think it would be the case because you should be able to see that in social mammals, and most on the ground mammalogists don't really think about this kind of thing. But it turns out where that data exists, that's exactly the kind of pattern they see. Now the branching ratios, the bifurcation ratios differ a little bit, but there's definitely that modularity, that fractality to how they organize their social structures. So the fact that humans do this actually might be just a background signal of how social mammals in general do this. We're just really good at it. Kind of like the energy game. Everything is playing this game, but humans, because of our advanced encephalization, are just really good at playing that game. So a lot of these traits that we think that might be very unique to human systems may actually have, a phylogenetic and evolutionary background that's already out there in the natural world. It's just we're very good at doing those particular things. So, how unique is the human species? We're unique socially, we're unique energetically, but we're not unique biologically. Biologically, we're a very predictable species, but energetically, we aren't. I focused on energy, and I've mentioned information a few times, but I focused on energy because, quite frankly, energy use is a lot easier to measure in human systems and anthropological systems than information use. Well, at least once you get beyond biological information, that is genetics. When you start thinking about cultural information and social information and the exchange of information and how that might be quantified or how you might be able to measure that as a latent variable, it gets to be very complicated, but obviously that's the flip side of what's going on. The two fundamental currencies in the universe are energy and information. And in human systems, we have these feedbacks, these economies of scale that we see in the energetics of all kinds of human systems, I think because we've coupled this with our information networks, our ability to exchange information and modify and store that information over time, and to come up with solutions to ecological constraints, to local constraints, is really how humans, I think, are unique in the biological world. So with that, I'll just mention my primary collaborators, James Brown at UNM, Jeff West at SFI, and Louis Betancourt. Jose is at ASU, and Hadrian's a mathematician at Oxford. Okay, thank you.
In the Army, you have like a set natural way of deciding like what the organizational levels are, because you can look it up on the website. But
yeah.
Like in the mammals or in the hunter-gatherer, it's like is there a kind of natural way of deciding like what counts as an organizational level and make sure you're not missing? Yeah,
exactly. That's a very good point. So, and that's a very real point. Yeah, so in systems where it's obviously discrete and defined and organized, yes, you just pick the numbers and you can just download them from the webpage. So in the hunter-gatherer data, for example, so the units are less clear, but there are, so they are relatively uncontroversial. So, we know that families exist, and we know that basically groups live as foraging bands or as members of foraging bands, and we know those foraging bands fluctuate. So if you measure them at the most dense and at the least dense, and then we know something about the total ethno-linguistic population. So what I showed there is basically a geometric scaling. Okay, so you're assuming the x-axis is discrete, but you don't have to make that assumption at all. You can just have it as a continuous variable, and then you just be talking about an exponential increase, and the exponent would mean exactly the same thing, that just on average, the rate at which people get together to do things is at this constant value. So again, we face this in firms. We try to do this in firms too, because they have some kinds of management structure, but the actual levels at which information is practically being transferred and acted upon usually got nothing to do with that structure. And so you have to try and sort of tease out these levels.
Email network and not the
Yeah,
org chart.
exactly. Yeah, you want the face-to-face interaction, not the pay grades, basically. Yeah. All right, Dan.
So this is very challenging material for me. It's very different than the way I'm used to thinking about the world. So forgive me if this is a naive question or one that reflects misunderstanding. If I understood you correctly, you want to say that when we look across, say, human societies that means of production, we see that the slope from which we're getting the economies of scale is relatively constant.
Yes.
It's just the intercept that's changing as a function of basically the efficiency of return on energy expended, right?
Exactly, yeah.
If you want to connect that to information exchange, then it seems to me that that relatively simple change in the intercept and maintaining the slope should change as a function of the information technology. Because as information exchange improves in efficiency, then the economies of scale should increase. So if you look at, say, I don't know, the patents issued per capita in the US Patent Office over the last 200 years, it shouldn't just be that the per capita rate is constant and it's just scaling up with the population size. It should be that the per capita rate is greatly increasing as the information exchange is more efficient. Right?
Yeah.
So that means that the slope should change, right? That the economies of scale should increase over time as the efficiency of information exchange increases with technology. And that there should be substantial inflection points in human history where the creation of technologies that facilitate larger informational networks, like writing, for example.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Obviously, telecommunications and the internet are, a major turning point. Going farther back in time, anything that moves beyond oral communication should matter.
Yeah.
And if you push it back even further, phylogenetically, you should see a similar inflection point with the invention of language, right?
Yeah.
The evolution of the language capacity. Because the information that elephants can exchange shouldn't look like the information that humans can exchange. So I'm surprised.
No, I doubt it does. Yeah.
Sorry?
I doubt that it does, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised when you want to make the case that the economies of scale, and frankly, I don't know what the difference between a self-similarity rate of 3 and a self-similarity rate of 4 is.
Yeah,
except
exactly.
that one is 33% bigger than the other. I can tell you that. Right?
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
don't look similar at all to me.
Uh-huh.
And the fact that we can, even hunter-gatherers can tell each other things about how to exploit the environment that elephants presumably cannot tell each other.
Yep.
Means that the economies of scale there should be multiple inflection points across human evolution, right?
Yeah, there's a great point. So that's it, yeah. So let me go back to some of those plots, actually. So I couldn't agree with you more in terms of basic assumptions of how this all should work. So let me get to this plot. So, okay, so what this is saying, so you have to think about the slope and the intercept, so the per capita efficiencies that are being achieved, and the slope, which is the rate of that achievement at the same time, not independently. So all this is saying, so you can plot, as I say, somehow you could just normalize this access to energy consumption, and you plot nation states on here. It would just be down here somewhere, okay? And if you plot cities on there, cities would show exactly the same relationship. And we can measure this data very, very closely in cities. So what this means is that the actual size or the actual per capita benefit that you're getting from interacting with a work colleague on a daily basis is the same that hunter-gatherer is achieving by interacting with a hunting colleague, but the scale of achievement that you're getting is different. So the per capita benefit is different.
So why doesn't the slope change as a consequence? Why don't you get...
Because the level of efficiency. So basically, when you're working with a colleague, this is saying that on an individual basis, there's a 25%, 1 minus 0.75, there's a 25% value-added benefit by working together than by working individually on a problem. And so it's 25% easier for you to come up with a solution to your problem by working with your colleague. And it's 25% easier for a hunter-gatherer to forage a particular plant or kill a particular mammal working with a colleague. However, the energetic benefits that you receive from doing that are adjusted to the scale at which you're operating, which is a very different scale, a very different energetic scale. But that's the remarkable thing. So it seems like in so yes, a perfect economy of scale would be this, yeah? So population size could just increase and you wouldn't have to increase area at all. But in no human system, no biological system, that requires you to break all kinds of laws of thermodynamics for that to occur. There have to be costs by adding individuals to a system. And even if we look at cities, for example, where you can actually measure the social infrastructure and rates of interaction between individuals and the outputs of those interactions, the GDP, the patents being produced, you see exactly the same kinds of scaling relationships. So in cities, in fact, the scaling relationships get a little bit steeper. So it scales at about 0.85. So as a city grows in size, the per capita, or the energy consumption of that city increases around about a scale of about 0.85, which is a little less efficient than in a subsistence indigenous setting. So, which to be honest is what we thought would be happening in this plot, because we thought that, okay, well, if you're investing in technology in order to, increase the energy return rate from your environment, maybe you're sacrificing a little bit of efficiency by doing that. You're just increasing the rate that you're getting it, but, there's got to be some cost to doing that. So we thought these lines would actually get steeper and they'll get closer to 1, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And so wherever they can be measured, at least in the data that we have, they've been less than 1, significantly less than 1, much greater than 0, and where they can be measured, with much greater precision than this in cities and in nations, for example, you see virtually identical scaling relationships. So what we think that ultimately is going on is there's got to be something, all the individuals playing this game are genetically very similar. We all have the same cognitive capacity, same biochemistry, same energetic requirements. And so there must be some kind of signal about the ability of humans to exchange information and benefit from that exchange of information, which is very hardwired into us, which is very, has deep evolutionary roots. And it's just the scale at which that's being played. And, if it was, genetic differences in our capacity to exchange information and store information, then I think you might actually see, changes in these efficiencies. But I think it's because, essentially everybody in that plot has the same cognitive capacity, and they have the same time on their hands, and they have the same kind of task to achieve. It's just the scale at which they're trying to achieve it is very different. Sorry, yeah, we're going to...
I'm wondering where conflict between people fits into this discussion, and I'm wondering if this is maybe the piece that was missing in Dan's question, like if email or ability to use language increases the efficiency of transfer of information.
Mm-hmm.
Is Dan thinking that's all gains? Where are the gains? Shouldn't we be getting more efficient? But some of those gains are being siphoned off into more intense competition between people. So is the inefficiency of competition between conspecifics built into this?
Yeah, Yeah, in several ways. So yeah, okay, so if you were to think about, you know, the efficiencies of, simple efficiencies of like being able to communicate in China or Australia instantaneously now, some, you know, mathematical result, you don't have to wait to send it through the mail. The efficiencies would be reflected in this plot in a dramatic drop in that intercept. And it turns out, yes, so the overall scaling would stay the same. However, as we were just talking about earlier, you know, a perfect economy of scale, something which is thermodynamically impossible, would simply be a flat line, yeah? So you increase the size of the system infinitely, and there's no energetic cost to doing so. That's a perfect economy of scale, okay? So a perfectly inefficient economy of scale is 1, or is greater than 1, where the energetic consumption of that system goes up as the size of that system goes up, but it goes up much faster. So if you think about it, there are constraints pushing up this way, trying to increase, well, there are constraints that are always trying to push this slope as low as you can, because it's increasingly efficient to do that. But there are also constraints pushing back up on that line, saying, you know, you can only achieve so much efficiency. You know, you can't be perfectly efficient. And so a lot of those constraints are going to include conflict over resources, conflict with conspecifics for energetics. So I think part of what's going on, at least in subsistence cultures, is you have, no matter who you work with, you've got to get a certain amount of calories per day. Okay, and there's always going to be some finite cost to doing that if you have to extract that from the environment. So that's going to be a constraint that's always going to be pushing up that line. However, the constraint that's pushing down that line is saying, yeah, but it's easier to do it when I'm doing it with more people, but it's only a little bit easier to do it with more people. It's not infinitely easier to do it with more people. So I think there's conflict and cooperation are directly behind, ultimately, you know, a deep theory that will explain where these scalings come from. Yeah.
So I'm just looking at these modes of production here, and so closer to 1 is a less efficient economy of scale.
That's right, yeah.
And yet, the agriculturalists and the pastoralists are closest, now maybe these are minuscule differences, I don't know.
Yeah,
But
there
I
will
mean,
be, yeah.
I'm quite surprised to see that what we think of as, I would have thought that the economy of scale would be greater for agriculturalists and pastoralists, and yet it's less than it is for foragers. Do you have any thoughts on?
Oh, so yeah, I don't have any confidence intervals around those numbers. And if you can see from the scatter of the data, I think they would all overlap. So I wouldn't necessarily pay much attention to the difference in the slopes between those groups. I think the overall point is all these groups that we can measure show very, very similar kinds of benefits, and they're all significantly less than 1, but I don't think they're significantly different from each other once you take into account the real and the statistical slop in the data.
Surprising to you? I mean,
Yeah,
it's kind of surprising to me, actually.
it's
that
very
they would be
surprising.
Different, and that they wouldn't be sort of in the opposite.
Yeah.
You could use these data to test the postulate, the conjecture that you just developed on the basis of Adam's suggestion, because probably per capita homicide rates, or at least estimates thereof, are available for those societies, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah.
PNG horticulturalists, this is a place that, you know, suffered endemic warfare,
Mhm.
and was basically at carrying capacity in the environment at the time of European contact.
Yeah, yeah.
They were just fighting each other constantly.
Exactly, yeah.
So, I mean, it should be the case that you can parcel out the conflict component as a limiting factor in the economy of scale there when you actually measure it.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Yes, and given the fact that now there's more and more interest in, you know, violence in indigenous societies, subsistence societies, yes, there'll be more and more data that's out there. So yeah, I could well be able to look at that. Yeah. Great. Sorry.
So we started out talking about metabolism and kind of energy budgets, but then
Mhm.
you know, moving to humans, we're introducing a really different kind of energy use. You know, we have things like bullet trains or
Mhm.
you know, SeaWorld or
Yeah.
water parks, or we put our energy budget to things like a space program that mostly doesn't feed anybody. Entertainment, convenience.
Yeah.
These are not what I would compare compare with, eating to stay alive in an animal.
Mhm.
These are energy uses that are distinctly non-functional in terms of keeping people alive, but you just add them in there as if they're part of that. How do you?
Yeah, no, very good point. So, okay, so in the metabolism world, in the biological metabolism world, you talk about basal metabolic rate, so just somatic maintenance, resting metabolic rate, that is just maintenance to stay asleep, field metabolic rate, which is the metabolic rate fluxed in order to fuel that, the basal metabolic requirement, and then total metabolic rate is what we're talking about here. So all those plus the extra building SeaWorld, flying to the moon, sending up satellites. All these are, these are energy costs that our society incorporates and we pay for in a very real way by extracting stored pools of energy in the Earth's surface in the form of fossil fuels. And so on a per capita basis, as a participant in that infrastructure, we are paying for that. And all of that is going into our total metabolic rate. So yeah, so if I was going to give a slightly longer talk, or more detailed talk, is I talk about the difference between basal metabolic rate and field metabolic rate in industrialized humans. So field, and in foragers. So field metabolic rate is about twofold greater than basal metabolic rate. So basically it takes 100% energy to capture the energy you need per day. Okay, so you have to double your basal energy budget. So our field metabolic rate sitting in this room is actually less than that of a forager. So it's easier for us, when you talk about the actual energy it takes to fuel the food that you need. So to actually go to the supermarket, to exchange, etc. There's a great efficiency that's built into that system. But the efficiency, the decrease in that field metabolic rate that we get is because we have this much larger infrastructure that we've paid for on top of that. So yes, we have the space program, but we also have sewage, and we also have road infrastructure, all the rest of it. And all of that is increasing, all of that is affecting our field metabolic rate. But yes, our total metabolic rate is everything that contributes to our energy budget beyond supporting your biological metabolism. Yeah. And that's the unique thing. All other species, they'll have some kind of extra metabolic rate because they'll have to dig burrows, build nests. All that requires extra energy, which isn't purely energetics to keep the system going, but it's infrastructure investments that they require in order to stay alive. It's just we've magnified, that part of our energy budget, which is the really unique thing about us. Yeah. So does that answer your?
Well, I don't mean infrastructure. I mean, I can get that, but some things
Mm-hmm.
are just entertainment, amusement, convenience that are not life supporting in any way, not interested. And that I don't know how you put that data in with the keeping you alive or that.
Oh, okay. I mean, basically, it's measured as quality of life. So basically, it just goes to your life standard. So in order for us to enjoy the standard of life, maybe people like going to football games or whatever on the weekends to relax, and all that cost is being paid for, whether you happen to go or not, by energy consumption on a basic level. So while that's not directly contributing, probably down the line to fitness some way, God knows. But yes, all that gets rolled into just the total amount of energy that us as a species consume to fuel the life that the lifestyles that we enjoy or that we utilize on a daily basis, compared to a deer of a very similar body size.
You're suggesting that we couldn't have the population size we do without SeaWorld and the Apollo mission?
No, but what probably happens is that's probably variation, that would be residual fluctuations around those scaling lines. So in the US, for example, there'll be a scaling across countries. The reason we're far above that scaling, as I showed in the plot that looked similar to that at the end of the talk, the reason why, United Arab Emirates and the US and the UK and things are above that is because that extra residual is because, yes, we do things like that, whereas poorer countries of a similar population size are going to be the residuals below that overall scaling line because they're not doing that kind of thing. Yeah. Hi, sorry, you asked earlier.
It's actually a little bit like Dan's question. When you're talking about this particular slide, I had a question in my mind with respect to hunters and gatherers, and thinking about the implications of saying that as the population size increases, the amount of area that you're needing is not increasing at the same rate.
Yeah.
Which means in effect that folks, hunters and gatherers, are being more effective in getting resources as their population size increases.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, but given, say, with hunters and gatherers, we have essentially a fixed set of resources, that is whatever nature provides.
Mm-hmm.
That would imply that in some sense you're also getting closer to carrying capacity with larger populations than with smaller ones. That is, if you're effectively utilizing more of the resources and therefore bumping up the population density, but you have the same set of resources that are available to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a conclusion I arrived at from a completely different viewpoint, which had to do with the question of looking at the response of individuals, of women, with respect to their reproductive behavior on the basis of the resource density, and coming up with somewhat of a similar argument, but from a very different direction, that in fact their decision making with respect to saying in effect, if it's easy to get resources, then I'm quite willing to have another child, but if it's hard to get resources, then I'll cut down on my having reproduction. And what gets across hunting and gathering groups, a similar sort of a pattern of going from relatively smaller population sizes in low resource density areas to be much closer to carrying capacity in high density resource areas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that would lead to the same slope as you have here, I don't know.
Yeah.
And certainly when one looks across not only hunters and gatherers, but the others, it's very unobvious whether it would have the same predictions.
Yeah, yeah.
But the question I'm getting at is, to what extent is it possible that some of what I'm seeing here is not just a question of, as you've argued about, communication with respect to a network and the implications that has in terms of scaling, but the fact that one in fact is having groups operating against resource bases that themselves have their own scaling properties.
Yeah.
That we can imagine, for example, if the world was composed of totally uniform resource bases, there is no variation within it whatsoever.
Yeah.
What would that do to our increasing population sizes against that kind of a resource base in comparison, let's say, to a heterogeneous resource base, and where you're also allowing for the scaling of that heterogeneity to vary as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one can imagine situations in which if the variability is great, well, depending on the variability, you can have a situation in which at low population sizes, you're sort of unable to average across that variation. You're called by something like Klybers Law, the minimum in terms of what population size you can maintain. But as population size increases, you begin to average across that variation, and therefore get that shift to a more efficient kind of adaptation. But in that case, it would have nothing to do with the question of networks and transmission amongst networks, but rather becoming a completely different route. Or is it that what we're really looking at here is a combination of both of them, in the sense that if one were looking at this at a finer scale, one would begin to see that within a set of dots of one color, they're not all falling along a given line, but if you begin to sort out in terms of, all right, resource variation, what scale is that taking place? Let's control for that. We might find some slopes are different than other slopes, but they're giving us all on sort of averages kind of.
Okay, yes, I agree with a lot of what you just said. And
particularly the nation-state scaling, where one could sort of say, well, you're reaching there at scale size.
Yeah.
That you've sort of totally averaged out the variation, and so increasing the size gives you no advantage from that viewpoint.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's where you're getting a slope of one.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I think there's a lot of things that you said there that yes, we thought a lot about. So first of all, in terms of the network structure, you have to think about this at a very sort of abstract, coarse-grained level when we talk about information exchange and energy exchange, and all of that is affecting fitness. So essentially, what this is saying on an informational basis, when you're talking about the averaging over, law of the minimum and averaging over environmental variation, what this is saying is that basically, if you think about hunter-gatherers networks, social networks of communicating hunter-gatherers as a sensory network, They're sensing the environment at some coarse-grained scale, and they're exchanging that information at some level with some efficiency built into that. This is saying that the larger that population gets, so the greater or the finer grained at which it can sense the environment and share that information, the better it is at essentially at averaging over that environment. So, and that's the efficiency, or that could be a large part of the efficiency. So down here, these smaller groups are pretty good at doing it, but you're really good at doing it once you have a certain amount of people. However, there's a finite limit to it. If you're a hunter-gatherer group, you don't need to interact with 10,000 people in order to understand your environment well. You need a network for, for genetic exchange, energy exchange, reproductive benefits, of a certain size. And it happens to be, the cutoff seems to be around about 1,000 individuals. So in terms of, another way to think about this is if these social networks have the effect of increasing the total amount of energy that's available to an individual, I think, yes, that's probably going to have a lot of reproductive consequences to it. Because, in human societies where we have this relatively slow reproductive rate, if you're increasing the amount of energy, the energy flow per individual, I think that's been translated into the reproductive benefits. So, like in a lot of foraging societies, obviously where mortality rates are really high, and the actual rate at which you're giving birth is relatively high, or spending your life being pregnant is relatively high. A lot of that's being fueled not by the individual mother, but by the social network that's supporting that behavior. And so I think a lot of that is coming. So I think there's a lot of reproduction. And essentially, reproduction is fitness, and this is all about the fitness consequences of being in larger social networks, being able to exchange information, and the effect that that's having on your fitness through your energy consumption, your ability to produce offspring and keep them alive. So, yes, so I mean, interesting to think if you could actually back out that benefit from this data, from the empirical economies of scale, so the per capita benefits, can you actually predict the effect on reproductive rates? Would be a very interesting thing to look at. So, does that answer your question? You had a few questions in there.
It was sort of an open-ended question to have a specific answer, but just more sort of throwing out for thought. Let me add one other piece to it, which is I'm sort of coming at it from two. But on the one hand, I find it very interesting the direction you're coming from in terms of saying that if we ask about communication between individuals and how much information can you communicate from one individual to the other.
Yeah.
Whether you're a hunter-gatherer or in the United States, it may not make that much difference.
Yeah.
That is, the information transfer may be pretty constant. It's a function of the nature of us as our biological nature, our cognitive nature, and that doesn't make a difference where you are there. That's going to be pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And then if one's saying that one has social networks that have structures that are relatively comparable to each other across all this variation in terms of modes of adaptation, then that is going to give you the kind of scaling law that one's talking about, give you the reasons why you're getting the scaling law. And that is certainly one aspect of it which makes a lot of sense. But then there's the other pieces of it as well that come into play over the same information that look at it in a slightly different way that suggests, well, maybe there's some other factors going on. So it's not so much I'm suggesting right or wrong, but rather to what extent is this right, or to what extent is something else, or is it really kind of a mixture of the two, or is it, can one say, well, yes, these other things are going on, but this is really the primary one, this is the first signature we get, the other ones are sort of secondary. So let me just get more into that, which is the questions, the upper size of the hunting-gathering group. That, this argument was leading to saying, well, it ought to be around 1,000 individuals in terms of the scaling laws you're looking at. But a totally separate argument, which is one I've worked on, is the question of what are the boundaries for hunters and gathering groups. The major boundary is kin recognition, be able to recognize somebody as kin to myself, and then by kin not in a biological sense, obviously, but in a cultural sense. And there you can argue quite simply that you're limited to get about the same thing. That is, in terms of the number of primary kin are the ones you know by virtue of having raised with them, secondary one, or a kin of your kin that you can determine what their relation is just by knowing their kin of your kin kind of thing.
Mhm.
This gives you an upper bound of around 800 to 1,000 individuals
Yeah,
as well.
sure, right.
Independent of any question of looking at the scaling
Yeah.
aspects to it. So here we've got two arguments that are coming to a similar position. Is this simply coincidental? Is there any?
No, that's okay. So and I talked with, I'm sure some of you know Kim Hill. So a lot about this. So, to him, the biggest question in hunter-gatherer studies is what constrains group size and population size. The scaling laws and the explanations I've been giving here have not said anything about what the constraints on that is. And so, so the fact that hunter-gatherer ethno-linguistic populations, the distribution is kind of log normal, and then it tails off into the, starts dropping off very quickly once you get above 1,000. What sets that constraint? I don't know. So at this very abstract level, yes, it must be something about information exchange, because hunter-gatherer population sizes do not vary predictably with environment. Right. Population densities do, but density is size over area. So area is responding predictably. But what's setting that constraint on N, we don't know. Is it a neutral process, something about language evolution? Is it something about, kin recognition, or, the size of social networks? But also what's setting these constraints on band size? So that's so at a coarser-grained level, at this total ethno-linguistic population level, maybe there's some explanation. But at the band level in hunter-gatherers, and I've got a paper that's just coming out about this using 3 independent data sets about, these magic numbers in anthropology about what a hunter-gatherer band size is. And yeah, they're just remarkably constant wherever you measure them. On all these independent data sets, hunter-gatherer bands, or the small bands, are usually about 15 to 20 individuals. And that doesn't vary predictably with anything. So there has to be some kind of informational constraint to that. But what I'm talking about here, getting to your first point, again, this is obviously a really abstract level. I'm just talking about fundamental currencies like energy and information. And obviously the anthropology comes in by saying, well, how are those things actually manifest on the ground? What's being partitioned into these things that we can actually measure, these social relationships, because all those details are how this information is being exchanged and how this energy is being acquired, and the benefits are all ultimately coming in that language. So this isn't saying, this is the primary explanation for all that stuff. What it's saying is, if you just zoom out to the largest kinds of coarse-grained currencies you can think of, these are the kinds of results you get. And if you were to zoom into each of those cultures, yeah, in order to explain those deviations, some of it's going to be measurement error, but some of it's going to be the actual anthropology of what these individual cultures are doing. And so there might indeed be different slopes between different cultures and different environments underlying this. But once you coarse grain out and you look at it at this scale, then it all seems to snap into place.
By chance, do you know Greg Johnson's work?
Yeah, sure.
Years ago.
Yeah.
On information.
Well, the scale of stress stuff. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Information on why do you get the magic number of about 30 for bands.
Yes, indeed, yeah. And we talk a lot about, his scale of stress ideas and, how to incorporate that. Because, in forages, that's a very common ethnographic observation. It's, if you have an argument with somebody or tensions start rising, you just leave and you go somewhere else, you join another group for a while. And it is this diffusion process. Whether or not it's as universal as he, as he thinks it is an open question. But yeah, it's interesting work, definitely.
Well, you can see other hunting gathering groups. I'm sorry.
No,
We're out of time.
we're out of
Okay.
time, so we might have to continue this after, but thank you.
Okay, right, thank you.